Imagine reading one page every morning for an entire year, and by December discovering that your reactions to traffic, criticism, loss, and uncertainty have all quietly changed without a single dramatic moment forcing the shift. That's the actual design of the book at the center of this video, built not as a single argument to absorb all at once, but as a slow, daily reshaping of how you interpret whatever happens to you. The book is The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday, written with Stephen Hanselman. It's structured as 366 short daily entries, one for each day of the year, each built around a passage from one of the three major Roman and Greek Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, followed by a short reflection connecting that ancient idea to a genuinely modern situation. Rather than arguing its case once, the book repeats and deepens a small set of core Stoic principles across the entire calendar year. Organized loosely by month, moving from clarity of thought early on through mastering emotion, taking right action, and finally by December, confronting mortality directly. The result functions less like a textbook and more like a long, patient training program for how to think. The foundation underneath nearly every entry in the book is a single distinction the Stoics return to constantly: the difference between what is within your control and what isn't. Holiday frames this as the discipline that everything else in Stoic practice depends on. Your judgments, your effort, your own choices, these are yours entirely. The actions of other people, the outcome of events already set in motion, the opinions others hold of you, these are not, no matter how much energy gets spent trying to manage them. The book returns to this distinction again and again throughout the year, applying it to career setbacks, personal criticism, and daily frustration alike. Because Holiday's argument is that nearly all unnecessary suffering comes from investing emotional weight into the second category as though it belonged in the first. Closely tied to this is what the book presents as one of the most practical Stoic exercises: negative visualization, sometimes referred to by its Latin name, premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Rather than assuming things will always go well, the Stoics deliberately imagine losses and setbacks in advance, not to become pessimistic, but to strip those outcomes of their shock value before they arrived. Holiday presents this as a form of insurance for the mind. Someone who has genuinely considered the possibility of losing a job, a relationship, or their health beforehand meets that event, if it actually happens, already partially prepared, rather than being caught completely off guard by something they'd never allowed themselves to consider. The exercise also works in reverse, sharpening appreciation for what currently exists, precisely because its impermanence has been genuinely acknowledged rather than assumed away. From this foundation, the book turns to a theme running through nearly every entry on emotion and reaction: the idea that events themselves are neutral, and it's the judgment placed on top of them that produces suffering. This is drawn directly from Epictetus, who argued that people are disturbed not by things themselves, but by the opinions they hold about those things. Holiday applies this repeatedly to modern frustration: a delayed flight, a harsh piece of feedback, an unexpected expense. None of these carry inherent emotional weight on their own. The distress arrives entirely through the interpretation layered on top. And because that interpretation is a judgment rather than a fact, It remains something a person retains real power to examine and revise, even in the middle of the disturbance itself. Another theme woven consistently through the book's early months is the Stoic claim that virtue alone constitutes the only true good, while everything else commonly chased in life, wealth, reputation, health, comfort, falls into a category the Stoics called indifference. This doesn't mean these things carry no value at all. Holiday is careful to note that the Stoics distinguished between preferred and dispreferred indifference, acknowledging that health is generally better than illness, and comfort generally better than hardship. But none of these external conditions were considered necessary for a genuinely good life, because none of them are fully within a person's control. And building your sense of worth around something outside your control leaves that worth permanently vulnerable to circumstances you can't guarantee. Character, judgment, and right action, by contrast, remain available regardless of external conditions, which is precisely why the Stoics treated virtue as the only good sturdy enough to actually build a life around. This same insistence on inner steadiness over outer circumstance shapes the book's recurring treatment of what it calls unbiased thought, the discipline of examining your own impressions honestly before accepting them as accurate. Holiday draws repeatedly on the Stoic idea that the mind constantly receives raw impressions of events, and that the real work of philosophy lies in interrogating those impressions before granting them assent, rather than reacting to them as though they were already established fact. A colleague's brief, curt reply in a meeting produces an immediate impression, perhaps that they're upset with you specifically. The Stoic discipline outlined across these entries asks you to pause and examine that impression rather than accepting it automatically, since the initial read is frequently distorted by anxiety, assumption, or simple lack of information. And treating an unexamined impression as settled truth is where a great deal of unnecessary conflict and distress actually originates. The book pairs this idea with sustained attention to the discipline of managing passion and impulse, treating emotional reactivity not as something to suppress entirely, but as something to observe and govern rather than obey automatically. Several entries return to the specific danger of acting in anger, since anger tends to compress the space between impulse and action to almost nothing, leaving no room for the kind of judgment Stoicism depends on. Holiday's recurring advice, drawn from Seneca in particular, is to build in deliberate delay, whether through counting, pausing, or simply waiting before responding, precisely because that small gap is where actual choice becomes possible again, after being briefly overridden by pure reaction. As the book moves through its middle months, it shifts from managing internal reaction toward a theme of right action, insisting that Stoicism was never meant to be a purely internal, contemplative philosophy. Holiday is direct that Stoic thought was built by people actively engaged in public and professional life, statesmen, soldiers, and advisors, not hermits withdrawn from responsibility. Virtue in this framing isn't an abstract quality to be admired. It's something demonstrated only through action, in how a person actually behaves when a decision is difficult, when no one is watching, or when the easier, less honest path is readily available. The book repeatedly draws the line between merely believing the right things and actually doing them. Treating the gap between the two is the real measure of whether a person's philosophy is genuine or simply decorative. This theme of action extends into the book's treatment of obstacles specifically, one of its most repeated and practically oriented ideas. Rather than treating a difficulty as something purely negative, standing between you and your goal, the Stoic reframing offered throughout the book treats the obstacle itself as material, something that can be worked with directly, even converted into the means of making progress. Marcus Aurelius's own writing, quoted repeatedly across these entries, describes obstruction as something that can be turned to advantage, since what stands in the way of an action can often become the action itself once approached correctly. Holiday applies this to ordinary modern frustration consistently. A canceled plan isn't purely a loss, it's also unclaimed time. A difficult colleague isn't purely an obstacle. Navigating them successfully is also a chance to practice patience and clarity under real pressure, in a way that easy circumstances never would have required. Alongside right action, the book devotes sustained attention to a theme it frames as duty, drawing on the Stoic conviction that individuals exist within a larger community and owe something to it beyond their own private advancement. Holiday repeatedly returns to the idea, drawn especially from Marcus Aurelius, that each person occupies a specific role, whether as a parent, a colleague, a neighbor, or simply a member of a shared society, and that Stoic virtue is demonstrated concretely by how well that role is actually fulfilled, not by how impressively it's described. This isn't presented as self-sacrifice for its own sake. It's framed as a recognition that individual well-being and the well-being of the surrounding community are genuinely connected, and that neglecting duty toward others tends to hollow out a person's own sense of purpose over time, even when the neglect isn't immediately visible or costly. This practical orientation culminates in a theme the book calls pragmatism, insisting throughout that Stoic philosophy was never meant to be an intellectual exercise pursued for its own sake, admired in the abstract without ever being tested against real circumstances. Holiday repeatedly emphasizes that the ancient Stoics judged an idea by whether it actually helped a person live and act better, not by how elegant or clever it sounded when merely discussed. This pragmatic thread runs as a kind of quiet check on every other theme in the book. Negative visualization, the discipline of judgment, amor fati. None of these ideas are presented as valuable simply because they're old or philosophically sophisticated. They're presented as valuable because they demonstrably change how a person handles an actual difficult Tuesday, and Holiday treats any Stoic principle that fails that test as not worth keeping. As the calendar moves toward its later months, the book turns increasingly toward acceptance, and specifically toward a concept the Stoics called amor fati, the love of fate. This goes further than simple tolerance of what happens. It asks the reader to actively embrace events, including painful or unwanted ones, as necessary parts of a larger, ongoing life, rather than interruptions to be resented. Holiday is careful to distinguish this from passive resignation. Amor fati doesn't mean abandoning effort or ambition. It means directing effort entirely toward what's actually within reach right now, without spending additional energy wishing the present moment were different from what it actually is. The book presents this less as an emotional trick and more as a genuine reallocation of energy, since resisting an already settled fact changes nothing about that fact and simply drains resources that could otherwise be spent on what comes next. By the time the book reaches its final month, its entries turn directly and repeatedly toward mortality, a practice the Stoics called memento mori, remembering that you will die. Rather than treating this as morbid, Holiday frames it throughout December's entries as one of the most clarifying tools available to a person trying to live with any real sense of priority. An awareness of genuinely limited time strips away a great deal of the trivial anxiety that tends to fill an unexamined life. The manufactured urgency of minor slights, status competitions, and distractions that would matter far less if held up against an honest accounting of how much time is actually available. Marcus Aurelius, quoted extensively in this closing stretch, wrote his own private reflections while surrounded by exactly this awareness, using it not to despair, but to sharpen his sense of what was actually worth his attention each day. Running underneath every one of these monthly themes is a practice the book treats as essential to making any of the philosophy actually functional rather than purely theoretical: daily reflection and self-examination. Holiday repeatedly points to the Stoic habit of reviewing each day honestly, asking what was done well, what wasn't, and what could be handled differently going forward. This isn't presented as self-punishment. It's presented as the maintenance work that keeps the rest of the philosophy from becoming abstract and disconnected from actual behavior. Without this ongoing, honest review, Holiday argues, even a genuine understanding of Stoic principles tends to fade quietly back into old, unexamined patterns of reaction. Precisely because insight alone, without repeated practice, rarely produces lasting change on its own. Every theme threaded through this year-long structure, drawn from clarity through action to duty, acceptance, and mortality, keeps returning to the same underlying claim the book opens with in January and never really abandons. You do not control most of what happens to you. You do control the judgment you attach to it and the action you take in response. That single distinction, examined daily rather than understood once and set aside, is what the book treats as the actual practice of Stoicism. Not a philosophy to be admired from a distance, but a discipline meant to be rebuilt, one ordinary day at a time, for as long as there are ordinary days left to practice it.